Hello, welcome. Welcome to Now What, the Future of New Jewish Culture. I'm Helena Gindi. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Posen Foundation. Now What is presented by Speakers Lab and the Jewish Daily Forward and is hosted by the 14th Street Y. This is the first event presented by Speakers Lab, a new public programming initiative of the Posen Foundation. And in the fall, we'll be hosting our second event, so please sign up for our mailing list and we'll keep you up to date. The Posen Foundation supports Jewish learning in universities, middle and high schools, and now with Speakers Lab, we're branching out into public programming. This November, we'll host a discussion with Amos Oz, Daniel Liebskind, and others at the 92nd Street Y to introduce the Posen Library, which is a 10-volume anthology of Jewish cultural works from biblical times to the present. We have a press release outside. Please pick it up if you want some more information. So, tonight, the idea for tonight's event came from something that happened last year. When the Jewish music label J-Dub's Records folded after almost a decade, it prompted a number of questions about support for Jewish culture, really about the future of Jewish arts and culture in America. Why is Jewish culture important? How do we tell what's meaningful from what's superficial? And what does the future hold? Tonight, you're invited to speak up. We'll begin with a conversation with the panelists, and then open the conversation to everyone here. And so without further ado, let me introduce tonight's panelists. So, Peter Stein is from the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival. Daniel Saratsky is the co-organizer of Occupy Judaism. Ari Roth is the artistic director of Theater J. We have Stephen Hazan Arnoff from the 14th Street Y and also LABA. We have David Jordan Harris from Rimon, the Minnesota Jewish Arts Council. We have Rachel Fearson, Yiddish arts critic. Alana Newhouse from Tablet Magazine. Jody Rosen, music critic for Slate. And Elise Bernhardt from the Foundation for Jewish Culture. And our moderator, Dan Friedman, the managing editor of The Forward. So, without further ado.
Thank you, Helena. So we've got lots of great panelists here tonight, and I've got lots of friends of familiar faces in the audience, and Ellie Valley. So I want to get started straight away and really ask a question which takes us to the what now, and to ask, so what are the trends in contemporary Jewish culture that show where we're going to in the future? And so someone on the perhaps the far table wants to take that to start with, or someone?
I kind of see things repeating themselves in the same way that the Jewish community historically has gone through a lot of rifts and splits and divisions historically, whether it was, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, or it was the rabbis breaking from the Kahanim, or the Misnagdim and the Hasidim, or the Maskilim and the Orthodox, and so forth. I think that we're going through another rift right now where you're seeing a split happening in American Jewish life between those who place kind of Israel at the center of their Jewish cultural orientations and those who place their diaspora Jewish identity and diaspora Jewish culture at the center of their Jewish identities. And I think that right now we're seeing that the Jewish establishment is kind of veering in the direction of kind of a singular Zionist orientation, while the people at the edges of kind of vibrant and unique and relevant Jewish culture are moving in the other direction, and the two aren't necessarily supporting each other.
Great, thanks, and we'll come back to Israel later. Middle table, Stephen, to start with.
I think in terms of the trends, one thing to note is that about a decade ago, there was a flourishing of new ideas, organizations, and a cluster of artists. It actually probably goes back about 20 or even 25 years, and Jewish music was part of the locus of that. And what happened is that those people have grown up. Many are not finding a home in the Jewish communal infrastructure. Those who have are finding it difficult to maintain their ideas and their vision based on what the infrastructure is prepared to hold and present. And the crisis is also the opportunity, which is what happens when, as Dan said, there are trends and patterns that repeat themselves. There will always be an ebbing and flowing of cultural activity. The question is, how can you engage it as a communal infrastructure to deepen and enrich the communal infrastructure and experience, or when it becomes, as you said, sort of a fringe? And I actually believe that without that quote-unquote fringe, which is not so far from the center ever, it's basically a patient on an operating table, and you're just sort of counting the minutes until you're not sure if it's worth saving it or not.
Okay, and the near table, Alana?
I guess I think the thing that's interesting for me, and in terms of our coverage, is outside of the people who identify themselves as part of the Jewish community or are striving to be part of the Jewish community, there's a whole lot of art being made. I'm thinking particularly by people who are the products of intermarriage, people who are the products of what they, like one Jewish grandparent. In fact, Tablet recently did a Q&A with a writer named Ben Marcus, who was never thought of to be a Jewish writer, but whose new novel, The Flame Alphabet, was called by our writer to be the best Jewish novel in years. And so the thing that interests me in terms of culture is actually the production of what I would call Jewish culture by people who do not identify themselves necessarily either as Jews or as part of the Jewish community. And in some ways that feels like an exciting space because we don't bring all of the questions that we know to it.
Great, and so let's take that on a little bit, and really still asking the same question about what do we see, but Alana's talking about identity and specifically Jewish identity. Now Jody, in his pre-event comments, and I don't know whether you've had a chance to see them, talked about the new Jewish culture as coming out of some of the 80s and 90s identity politics. So I don't know, what is the identity that comes out of that? What are the identities, I guess, that we see in contemporary Jewish culture?
I don't know if I can address the question broadly, but I can talk about what I've experienced, and I think I'd echo what Dan said a little bit, which is that what I've noticed among people, my contemporaries, is this interest in diasporic Jewish experience, not identifying themselves. Israel not being the be-all and end-all of their Jewish identity. Moreover, the kind of the old schism, the old interest in the sort of Jewish old world, Bubby and Zadie, that feeling a little burdensome to some people. I sort of got involved in, to the extent that I'm at all involved in Jewish communal life. It's through the organization known as Reboot, which some of you may know. This is a kind of loose affiliation of, I don't know, Jewish hipsters, ne'er-do-wells, artsy-fartsy types, who have an annual summit, which I just got invited to out of the blue. I don't exactly know why. Well, it's, anyway. But what interested me, what I took away from that experience is exactly what Alana was saying. There were people who were not, normatively Jewish. There were people who were half-breeds. There were people who had completely irreligious upbringings, kind of like myself. And there, at Reboot, everyone's weird Jewish identity was affirmed as Jewish. And for me, this was a revelation, because I personally grew up feeling estranged from the Jewish community and kind of longing, like a lot of assimilated Jews, for some Jewish connection. And then I realized, God, I had a lesbian mother on the Upper West Side. How much more Jewish can it get? But one other thing I'd say is that I think there's been interesting kind of Jewish history and historiography, a new kind of Jewish history and historiography, which some of the people who were involved in Reboot, I point to a book like this book called Bar Mitzvah Disco. Okay. Now, on the one hand, this looks like a silly. Does anyone know this book? It's like a collection of, reminiscences, memoirs of people's 1980s bar mitzvahs with cheesy photographs from, and awful memories of having to stagger through your Torah portion, right? Okay, and on the one hand, it seems sort of like kitsch culture, right? But what I've found is that those sorts of that kind of Jewish cultural production, affirming those experiences as important Jewish history is great. And what we're doing is we're getting a richer, fuller picture of what Jewish American life is, and it's not all bound up in the old questions and the old ideologies.
Great, and maybe thanks, Jody. And Rachel, I know you've spoken or you've written about some of these questions of kitsch and how they may or may not move forward, and of course the question of Yiddish culture in contemporary Jewish society is bound up with some of these questions of how we think of as Bubi and Zaidi. So I don't know how do you see Yiddish culture having part of that hybrid vigor, and I think we should probably steer away from calling anyone in the community a half-breed, but but taking some internal and external cultures and marrying them together in a positive way.
Well, I will agree with Jody that I think people our age, certainly people younger than I am, are hungry to see themselves affirmed, because so many people, I extrapolate from my own experience, but so many people see a disconnect between their own Jewish lives and the sort of institutional narrative. So, as I wrote in my piece that was published in the foreword, that if you go to, say, just like I did, a conservative Hebrew school, and you see this narrative that has to do with modern Hebrew, for example, and then you go home and you have a parent who says the blessings with a Ashkenazi accent, and you say, well, that's wrong, and there's this disconnect, and there's this, it creates a dissonance inside oneself that, like, your Jewishness is wrong. And I think that people my age are really hungry to understand why that is and to see themselves represented. So I think that's really, really important, and I understand the impulse of where the reboot projects are coming from and the people who respond to them too. That I can't emphasize enough what a big problem this is, that we do not see our experiences, our families, our histories are denigrated, they're treated as irrelevant, as dead. I think that's disrespectful to say, oh, the grandparents, whatever, they're dead, they don't matter. But at the same time, I would say that it's important to go beyond that, because if you just stay there and say, I have to affirm my experience, then you're never really grounded in something larger than yourself and something larger than your own experience. And that's why, for me, Yiddish is so important, and my community, these are people who have connected with this thing that's larger than themselves, but also that feels very authentic, feels very real, feels resonant. So I think that you have to ground yourself in something bigger in order to move forward.
Great. Elise, do you want to come back on that?
I want to talk about... I'm supposed to keep it close, right? Okay.
Whatever
Revival
works.
of Yiddish. I think the revival of Yiddish in Israel, among other places, certainly here, speaks to this kind of going back to something that was lost, that was repressed, that was no longer okay, that is now becoming really interesting to young people. We had a theater director in Jerusalem. He was investigating the confluence of Yiddish and the avant-garde in the 20s, and what he discovered was the interest in young people in all kinds of weird spaces in bringing Yiddish back, and people sort of came out of the woodwork saying, oh yes, this is like a whole new revival. And I think that the energy around making something that's so old part of your revised sense of your Jewish self, whether it's Yiddish or whether it's Ladino, or whether it's some other part of Jewish expression, making it relevant in your own terms, I think is a really important piece of maybe, I hate to use the word trend, but it feels like a kind of an evolution. And I'm trying to remember who said it was you. This is just like a new reframing of a constantly evolving thing. But I like the I like to say that people's interest in authenticity seems to me to be the really important piece of what's evolving in Jewish culture. I think we see people really obsessing over incredible details of some aspect of Jewish life that they're really going to dig into. And that kind of rigor, bringing that kind of rigor to a subject and then making something really potent about it, to me, is where I think we can really hope for some profound, perhaps occasionally profound, transcendent kinds of experience.
Yeah, Dan? Oh, and then Peter afterwards.
I just wanted to say in response to the last couple of remarks that I think that this notion of affirmation is in fact the key that's driving what's happening in Jewish culture now. So much of our Jewish history has just been represented as Cossacks and then the Holocaust and then Israel, and it invalidates our actual cultures and histories and roots. And now we're in a position where we're not necessarily repressed in the same way that we had been historically, and that we can start to explore our identities and branch out. If you remember a decade ago, Time Out published that magazine, that issue, The New Super Jews, that talked about this kind of renewal of Jewish culture, and it was because Jews were finally comfortable coming out as Jews and being who they were and not being ashamed of their identities. A perfect example of this was actually the Occupy Kol Nidre service that I helped organize, because you had 1,000 Jews come out into the middle of the street to do this prayer service that traditionally was done behind closed doors and seems a little cultish and weird, and I don't want anybody to see what we're doing because they might get the wrong ideas. And we went out in the streets and did that ritual, and tied into it aspects of contemporary social justice values that mesh with our Jewish values. And I had a line of people coming up to me afterwards saying, "Thank you so much. That was the first time I ever participated in a Jewish prayer service where I felt like I could be fully who I was and not have to repress part of my identity in order to participate, that I could fully be me." And I think that that's kind of the biggest thing that is happening, is that we as Jews feel like we can be ourselves. We don't have to be afraid of who we are. We can express our identities in all the different forms that they take, whether you are a secular atheist or a black Hasidic gay rapper.
Right. For those who don't know what Dan's referring to, Yitzi Wylov in today's Out magazine explained that he was in fact not just a black Jewish Hasidic rapper, but was a gay black Jewish Hasidic rapper. So Peter.
Yeah, that's a good segue to what I was going to point out, was that at least in the Bay Area, this kind of mashup in a way, this attempt to meld one's Jewish identity with the other hats that one wears, or the other cloaks that one puts on, or the other closets that one emerges from, has been going on for a long time, and that is part of what is, going back to your original question, sort of where is the future pointing? I do think that there's a certain national still discomfort with what does it mean to be Jewish and still feel relevant to the other values that may not seem that they are related to Jewish values. What is my role as an artist in expressing myself when I'm not naming myself explicitly a Jewish artist? And that's something that I know, at least in the 30-something years of the Jewish Film Festival, that is exactly what was celebrated on screen, was that you can actually be many things, wear many hats, and the audience members could be many different things, and still count yourself as part of this community that was beginning to come up with its own definitions for what it meant to be Jewish. Now that said, I do think, and it's a question really that you raised, Stephen, it is, what is the nature of the crisis, quote unquote, and that's the word that you use, the crisis that Jewish culture, and new Jewish culture is in, if we say that J-Dub collapsed and the wonderful Traveling Jewish Theater, which was a seminal theater company in the Bay Area, last night closed its doors finally. So I'm not sure that those two things equal a crisis, but I'm curious to hear what is it exactly that we are wringing our hands about, as we are wont to do as a people.
No, I think it's always, it's exactly. I'd worry if we weren't wringing our hands about something. Maybe you come to Ari. Good. Because to talk about, maybe either what's new or what the crisis is, or whatever your response to what we've been talking about.
Well, maybe the crisis is this perceived exhaustion with the bread and butter issues that define 20th century Jewish engagement that we have not talked about yet, but that's genocide that unfolded, genocide in our times that continues, and the drama of the Israel Project. And those remain issues that the art must address, no matter how frickin' exhausted we might be about it. And so I think there is there is a need and a compulsion to still engage in the test that each of these traumas and dramas pose to us. So, you know, I think I don't find myself in this conversation about the fascination with Yiddish culture. I know running what I consider to be a successful and vibrant Jewish theater in the nation's capital, we have positioned ourselves curiously sort of against the trend of the last 10 years in New York Jewish culture, I think. And I'm talking about the fascination of the Bible speaking to us anew and the beckoning of Yiddish. And those I recognize are very important, but I have seen my theater goers run the other direction time and time again when I've programmed work like that, that engaged in sort of postmodern hipster Bible stories. Or I find that there is a deep hunger to get back to the difficult questions. And I see artists, Jewish and non-Jewish, rising to the challenge of it. I think the crisis is institutional leadership, the fecklessness of institutions in the Jewish community, and the need for artists to challenge them and change them.
Right. And I'm mindful of the fact that David hasn't spoken and is a Jewish institution, and then we'll come to Alana after that.
Well, there's so many elements that one can respond to here, but another dimension of this crisis is to look at it as an opportunity. One of the crises that many artists feel is the relationship with their audience, with the funding sources. How can they get word of their work out into the public? And so the crisis and the opportunity is a redefined relationship with the community. What is this community that's being referred to anyway? There's an enormous Jewish population, only some of whom feel that they belong to that community. What does it mean to expand those parameters so that rather than positioning ourselves in counter-distinction to the Jewish community, we actually say, wait a minute, this is mine to make, this is mine to lead. So the leadership in some ways comes from the margins, and we don't just cede the leadership to institutional leaders.
Great. Alana?
I just wanted to point something out that frequently I get smacked in the face with, which is this idea that the fact that I was oppressed my life with somebody telling me what Jewishness was supposed to be actually is a privilege that most American Jews don't experience, because in fact their parents didn't tell them anything about Jewish life. And I have to realize that the thing that I whine about is actually something to be jealous of, because I was able to create my identity in part because I threw those definitions away, because some of them threw into sharp relief my ideas. But the point was, somebody got me in a conversation. And for most American Jews, for a lot of American Jews, particularly a lot of young Jews, and this goes to the audience versus artist question, I think, they don't even know how to get to the table to ask themselves these questions about whether or not they're Jewish or what their relationship is to the Jewish community. And so I feel like if we were going to talk about a crisis, in addition to institutional crises, which I think certainly exist, the bigger challenge for me is, I think, in the disconnect between artists and the audience, in part because I think many people who are creating art have had this privileged experience of knowledge and actual immersion in something that felt Jewish, whether it was Israel or Yiddish or religious life or culture. Whereas most of their audience, they're not speaking the same language. So to me, if I was going to pinpoint some not that I feel comes up again a lot for me, that would be it.
So instead of the rabbis of yore preaching from their Talmudic knowledge, it's the people who have the Jewish upbringing preaching Jewish culture to the people who don't.
Right, I think it's that there are people for whom the operative drama of their lives was a fight with their parents or their grandparents about whether or not they actually really did need to go to shul on Shabbos. But actually, for most American Jews, that's not even something. I mean, they don't care about that, or whether or not they go to the Holocaust Memorial at their synagogue. There are a lot of American Jews who I think would hunger for somebody to actually make them go to anything Jewish, even a Holocaust Memorial. So that's and which may be its own depressing thing to understand, but that's my experience.
Great, and Rachel?
Yeah, I actually also wanted to push back, first of all, on this idea of whether there's a crisis in arts, or what was the meaning necessarily of J-dub folding, which was unfortunate, excuse me, folding. And I think that these things are cyclical. I think that, I certainly know from my research around Yiddish that you could find in any decade since, probably since the turn of the century, that people would say, oh, there's a Yiddish revival. Oh, now we're really seeing something. Oh, this is new, this is different. So I'm a little bit unmoved by talk of revivals or crises. However, I do think there is a crisis. There's a real crisis, which Alana was pointing to, and this is a crisis of literacy. Okay, so I actually have this hanging in my office on the wall, which people think is very strange, but it's inspirational to me, and it's a slide from the 2010 National Population Survey. It's the summary slide. Bullet point: majority of Jews uninvolved in Jewish communal life lack education. So to me, that is shocking. I don't know how we can talk about anything else if the majority of Jews are uninvolved in Jewish communal life, lack education. That's step zero. You can't do anything if people literally they can't even speak. They don't even feel involved. They don't know how to talk about anything Jewish. So for me, the crisis around Jewish arts is that there's a lack of educated audiences, there's a lack of educated critics, because there's a lack of literacy about Jewish art. So if there's some amazing new Yiddish song cycle, for example, how many people are there who can even talk about that in an educated way? And I don't mean to say that snobbishly, but that we need people who can talk about and explicate art and guide people. So if we don't even have people who can write about these things knowledgeably, how can we expect audiences to come to the art knowledgeably and be interested in it? So that crisis stems from the larger crisis.
Can you just read, is it the people who are involved or uninvolved, or just because I think you read it different ways, different times. Just read it one more time. Majority
of Jews uninvolved in Jewish communal life lack education.
Okay, so there's two attributes of a group of people. Most people are uninvolved and they lack education.
And subpoint. Even among those who identify, quote, by religion, majority do not belong to synagogues, participate in Jewish life cycle events, or have visited Israel. Which says to me that the conversation around Jewish identity in the United States is so narrow that people think that, oh, I'm not religious, therefore, I'm not Jewish, or the only way that I know that's a legitimate way to identify as Jewish is as religious. So if I'm not going to shul, I'm a bad Jew, or I don't even exist. Whereas I think a lot of these people, if there were an option outside of participate in Jewish life cycle events, visiting Israel, going to synagogue, I mean, that's only 3 things, but being Jewish is a much larger experience, and I think that we need to find ways to capture and measure that. That doesn't just reduce it down to these really narrow spaces.
Foundation for Jewish Culture.
Okay. So, without naming names, I'll just say that one of the programs that we do was designed, in fact, to open the doors for people, young people, who had no connection to their Jewish identity. And that program has numbers, it has stats, it has proven itself, it has gotten all kinds of people to have, I want to say religious with a small r experiences because of the nature of how powerful they were, because some artists took some ancient tradition and turned it on its head, and people thought they were at a rock concert, except that they were listening to some high holy day service. You got my drift. Except that after lots of money, all of a sudden there isn't going to be money because it's too niche. You know, I'm really interested in the person who doesn't know anything. Okay, I'm interested in the person who doesn't know anything too. But you know, the only way to get to the person who doesn't know anything is to give them something really interesting to chew on. And I think the crisis has to do with, what was that word? What is it, the thing you put under the sculpture to keep it going up, the frame, the like?
Scaffold?
It's like the scaffolding, yeah, okay. So the scaffolding of the Jewish community has got one idea about how they're going to make people connect and another idea about who those illiterate people are. And yet they don't have this, you know, this stick-to-itiveness to believe that the power of a really well-informed, intelligent experience will actually ripple out to people who don't know the details. If you get, you know, this is the same thing in the experimental art world. People say, oh, but I don't get that. I didn't go to art history. But you know, a really profound art experience will get to everybody. It will hit people in different ways. And to have the faith that our artists are capable of taking our traditions or thinkings or language or what have you from 5,000 years of civilization and turn it into something that could be really powerful and pay for it. And pay for it because, okay, now I get to get my little slide out. Thank you, Marcy. 1% of the 16% of Jewish giving in total non-Israel related Jewish giving, 1% goes to arts and culture. You know, that's like such a tiny amount of money for the people of the book, symphony, museum, et cetera. It's film, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we don't pay for making our own civilization, and I think that's the crisis.
And I just, we're going to come around. I just want to just try and list a little bit because we talked about 5,000 years of history and we talk about a crisis. But let's just, I just want to enumerate what we've said on this panel this evening is new here tonight. Not here tonight, but new in after 5,000 years. One, we're in a place and a time where the Jews are not oppressed by being Jews. We're in a place and a time where a variety of different types of Jewish experience are affirmed, not only by the external culture, but by the internal culture. We have a specific situation in history where there is a Jewish state, and it is in a particular state of embattlement and cultural vibrancy. We're facing a particular form of cultural and possibly religious illiteracy on percentage form, and also, as David said, partly because of technology and partly because of our geographical location, we've got a changing relation with our audience or with our congregation or our community or however you figure that. So I'm just trying to, that's what we've said tonight. I'm not trying to editorialize on that at all. Dan has something to say.
I just wanted to ask Elise, did you say that only 16% of funding in the Jewish community is not Israel related?
I said 1% of the 16% total non-Israel related Jewish giving goes to arts and culture.
So only 16% of the money that is allocated in the Jewish community, and I believe that the Jewish GDP was something like $10 billion annually in giving. Only 16% of that is spent on non-Israel related stuff. That would seem to be your crisis right there. I mean, the reality at the end of the day is that the funders in the Jewish community have their own priorities, and the Jews in the Jewish community have a very different set of priorities. And the funders tend to skew towards the right wing of the political spectrum. And because of that, they seek to use Jewish institutions to advance the particular goals of their right-wing political agenda. And if it comes to propping up Jewish culture to enrich the lives of Jews for the sake of just having meaningful and vibrant Jewish culture, there's no bottom line in that for them. They don't see the connection between Jewish arts and culture and Jewish peoplehood and support for the state of Israel. Therefore, why am I going to put my eggs in that basket when I can just give all my money to Stand With Us or some other Israel advocacy organization that supplants a cultural Jewish identity with a Zionist identity, which seems to elicit far more, fervent passion from its participants.
I have to wait. I have to.
There's a clarification.
I have to stop you because I didn't describe the whole slide, and it really should be up there. Okay, so this is total dollars to Jewish, Israel-related, and non-Jewish causes. Now get this: 76% of all Jewish giving goes to non-Jewish causes. Only, no, this is important. 8% goes to Israel, and 16% goes to non-Israel, and of that 16%. So I still believe everything you say, but
There's an argument about particularist funders and non-particularist funders, but thanks for at least for clarifying that. Stephen, you had a point.
Well, I would encourage us all to focus on due diligence with whatever we're citing as fact, because facts have a way of being useful to people who have a point to make. So let's just stay focused on that. I also agree with much of what you said, but for the record, let's agree what the record is. Secondly, I think there's a level of immaturity to say that somehow it's an us-them situation. I think it's a level of immaturity to say that artists have not always had to scratch and claw for resources to do their work. There's always been some form of infrastructure, whether it was the church or whether it was the government or any number of other things. I don't know what's happening in the cave during that first image, but there was always a system where resources need to be harnessed so that artists could make art, and some were good at the game and some weren't. Some who were not good at the game wound up having their paintings sold for millions of dollars long after they died in poverty, and some who were really good at the game still died in poverty, and their paintings were not sold for millions of dollars after they died. What I would suggest is that there is an infrastructure that exists, which is called Jewish communal life. The families that you described as the audience of the audience that is grown up with or without Jewish life, that's a Jewish partner, a non-Jewish partner, a gay couple, a family that has a grandparent who's Jewish, for whatever it is, they want to be in a Jewish institution. That's our preschool, right here in the East Village. Those are our families. We put in an artist in residence program called LABA 4.5 years ago. Our enrollment across the board at the Y has tripled in size since that time. The reason why is because we have a great team, we have a great board that believes in what we're doing, and ultimately we've said we want to enrich the life of everybody here with the arts. And we want artists to be role models, we want artists to be free, we want artists to be funded, we want artists to take risks. We also want artists to be involved in our ability to build resources so we can do all those things. And I don't think it's an us or them. I think it's a question of being savvy, politically savvy in terms of building and shaping resources so that rather than saying the machine has left the building, the machine only leaves the building when you don't want to be engaged with the machine. And I love what Ari said about the responsibility, in a sense, of artists, not just to find the way to lock into resources, but to push and push and push any structure, institutional or not, for beauty and truth and challenge and questions. The crisis is that not enough people are doing that, and that there are not enough people appreciating that they're doing that, and ultimately, there's an explosion of interesting work right now. And it's beautiful and it's great, and we just need to keep finding the ways to make it sustainable.
Barry?
We're at this moment of abundance and scarcity all at the same time, and there are the experiments that are thriving, and your report is really, really heartening because it is a revival of this very building, of this. I mean, you talk about Jewish communal life. We extend that the Jewish cultural communal life. You're saying the culture has enriched the growing community, and I would echo your points that the artist's interaction with the audience, the artist's responsibility to be part of generating audience and creating a new congregation that is interested in 21st century, challenging, fascinating, fabulous art, and that being a touchstone for a new kind of literacy, a new kind of way of celebrating who we are. And so there's a lot to be excited about, even as we mourn J-Dub and TJT. They had good runs, and there was something missing, some financial backbone that would
Can I just say
sustain
one thing?
them. Yeah.
Just in terms of J-Dub, as long as we're talking about facts here, J-Dub is a record label. Does anyone notice what's been going on in the music industry? Okay, major labels are not doing well. To say nothing of a essentially self-funded little Jewish record label venture. Okay, and we could say the same thing. I mean, no disrespect to J-Dub, which is a great thing. I mean, there's a perennial crisis in arts funding in this country, and we're seeing it now in places in Europe where traditionally the arts have been lavishly funded. So if there's a crisis there, I don't think it's a particularly Jewish crisis. There's a larger crisis, and we should bear that in mind. But anyway.
Yes, Peter.
Yeah, just a quick point. I think one of the things that I notice is that what's difficult for many artists is to feel that in becoming a named or funded Jewish artist, that somehow their art needs to change, their project needs to change, the pressure starts to mount as to what their own identification with Jewish life is. I mean, Jewish artists have been making work in the world, particularly in the United States, extremely successfully. It just hasn't been named as Jewish art, whether it's Hollywood or Seinfeld or you name it. The question becomes, I think for us, when does it become reasonable and not just praiseworthy, but sustainable for an artist to be making work within a Jewish community context? I know lots of film distributors who won't place their extremely successful and very obviously thematically Jewish films. They won't place them with Jewish film festivals because it becomes, as Elise said, too niche. Oh, that audience is going to come already because Jews are interested in Jewish stuff. So that the task for Jewish cultural and arts institutions and artists who identify themselves even reluctantly or kind of spasmodically as making work with Jewish themes is to be comfortable in that space that says I am both an American artist or a artist of the world making work, and I can occasionally wear a Jewish hat.
Can I just say one other thing? As long as we're talking about popular culture, if you look at popular culture, there is the very opposite of a crisis in Jewish culture. Okay, let's think about Larry David, Sacha Baron Cohen, the Coen brothers made the most Jewish movie. What's the name of that movie? A Serious Man. Give me a break. That was a movie about communal Jewish life in suburban Minneapolis. Okay, it was. And
you say that like it's a bad thing.
I don't. This crisis that exists, I'm not sure that it exists. I think this goes to what I was trying to say earlier, perhaps a little ineloquently. There's this kind of sentimentality and piety about what is, there are questions about Jewish authenticity, and I think often the gatekeepers of true Jewishness do not accept as Jewish those very Jewish things that, in fact, are at the center of, in the case of the United States, mainstream American culture, from White Christmas by Irving Berlin on down. That's Jewish culture. So when we're talking about getting funding for, local Jewish theater, that's one thing. But the Jewish culture is incredibly vibrant, I think, up and down. Now, funding is a different question.
So I think that's an incredibly valid point. I think that all of us, probably all of us, really recognize that especially for me as an outsider, that American culture is deeply Jewish in a way that English culture it really is not, and I think that's an important with Sacha Baron Cohen as a singular exception, and that's important to note. But so how does that fit into our discussion about what Jewish culture is, and is that the future? Is the future of Jewish culture just American culture?
Well, can I just point out that Philip Roth never published with a Jewish press.
All right.
Okay, so this is not a new thing. The question that I think is bothering some people on the panel, and does bother me, is what Jewish institutional life will fund. That is a separate conversation that in some ways does need to get parsed away, but it needs to happen in the context of something else, because I I do want to say that I think that there are artists who traverse both in and out, and certainly the audience, that find something a little infantilizing and certainly entitled about the attitude on the part of certain people and certainly certain artists that feel that the Jewish community must and should fund them, when in fact the Jewish community has a limited number of resources and maybe can't necessarily fund every single thing. Now, I say that within the context of believing that arts is always underfunded, and the Jewish community does underfund the arts and culture. But that said, the question of what the Jewish community must fund and what is its obligation to fund, even if it, basically what I want to challenge people to do is argue whether or not you believe that obligation is a word here. And if you do, what you believe the Jewish community is obligated to fund. Because that, I think, does get at a question that I have. I don't know the answer, but that's what I'm interested in.
But the Jewish artists who care about the soul of the Jewish people and the Jewish community have an obligation to speak to and work within that communal structure. I mean, the Jewish community needs artists to make it more soulful, to make it more cognizant of all that goes into informing policy that will affect Jews, not just culturally, but politically and socially. So there is this question of what is the role of the artist within the formal community, and not just within the marketplace.
So David, are you waiting to speak?
Yeah, there are two different aspects of this that I think are worth noting, which is that Philip Roth, of course, has been with us for a long time, but there was a distinct phenomenon that has happened in the last 20 years, that so-called Jewish culture broke out of the Jewish institutions, and you'd see mainstream theaters. This is certainly true in the Midwest, where I'm based, that were producing what previously we would have thought were Jewish plays. This is true all across the performing arts, certainly, and in the visual arts as well. So this is a fascinating and productive development in American Jewish life, where it lives outside of what we used to think of as designated Jewish spaces. And this, I think, liberates us in terms of having a more interesting idea of what these identities are that we all live with. And we all live with multiple identities. It's a mistake to only go for one. The second thing I'd like to say has to do with our ability to tell our story as effectively as we can as artists. I recently had the interesting experience of telling a board of communal leaders, they wanted to know what was the most significant misunderstanding about the organization I ran and the work it did. And I said, well, right up there is your belief that the arts are actually a rather narrow, have a rather narrow base in the Jewish community, and those who are interested should pay for it, and the rest of us have no obligation to it. To which I responded to them, in Minnesota, decisively more people go to nonprofit arts events, like 3 times as many, as go to all of our sports teams, professional sports teams put together. Their jaws drop to the table because, of course, when they read the newspaper, there's a whole section every day about sports, and the arts coverage is minuscule. I said, you have the option to ignore the fact that much of the Jewish community regularly is going to arts events, and it matters to them enormously. Ignore that if you wish, but then you're ignoring where your own constituency lives. And I think they were flabbergasted, because that's not a story that's told of them often enough.
Right. And I think Elise has a point, and then I want to, there's some of our guests in the audience who have questions, and I'll bring it out to those as well.
Yeah, I just want to say something about roles and obligations. I'm big on Bezalel. It's my favorite character. If you do a little Torah reading, he's in the same chapter when Moses gets the new set of commandments. He's right before the obligation to observe the Sabbath, and he has these 3 attributes, which are craft, knowledge, and divine inspiration, Ruach Elohim. And I feel like it's so important in the absolutely first text that the artist is so central. Like, there would be no Mishkan, the people would have nothing to follow, there would be no place for God. I mean, really central. And so here we are, arguably in the most, at least financially successful group of Jews. It's probably in politics, like I like to say, the Jews do own the media, and they're pretty big in politics too, and they have more money, and yet, there isn't this centrality. I mean, Stephen, you have accomplished an enormous amount, and you really ought to be on everybody's television show across the Federation system, because...
They defunded the TV systems.
Oh, yeah. But what I'm saying is, like, the idea that the artist is integral to our society and always was. Like, this should be the time when we shouldn't... Yes, artists are always at the bottom of the barrel, but if there's any time in Jewish civilization where they should really be elevated and that they should have a place at the table, and I mean at every table, I think this would be the time that should happen. And really your policy, you know, the idea of having an arts policy within Jewish life, I think speaks to that and should be pursued. Because if it doesn't happen now, I don't know if it's ever going to happen.
Great. Do we have the microphone for the audience? So, do people have questions or to ask? A question at the back.
Sort of two sides of the same question, maybe, for the two halves of the panel, roughly. For the sort of roughly half of the panel that feels like there's maybe the crisis is that there's not enough people educated enough in what Jewish culture is, or don't know enough to participate. If you could meet one of those people and sort of snap your fingers, and tomorrow they would know what you want them to know, or be as Jewish as you want them to be, what would they know, or who would they be? And for the sort of roughly other half of the panel that seems to feel like we are so assimilated and empowered and dispersed now that the umbrella is so wide, do we even need a separate Jewish culture? And if so, why, and what is it?
Great. So, Alana, do you want to address the question of literacy?
It's interesting. I actually, you asked the perfect question. I'm really happy you asked it, because I wanted to clarify what I meant. I do think that there's a crisis in literacy, but the issue that I was trying to get at was not that. I was trying to get at the fact that Jewish identity is not actually a conversation that a lot of people are having with their kids. So do I care if somebody's mother says, being Jewish is making your grandmother's brisket? No, because if you grow up and then you decide, no, it's not, that's ridiculous. It's not making my grandmother's brisket. Also, I hate her brisket. Like, that's fine, right? And then you're like, actually, Jewish identity for me is about music, or it's about religion, or it's about Israel. The point is, I just want there to be an emotional beginning, like the first thread that gets pulled, where actually somebody is having a conversation with people and telling them that their Jewish identity can be many things, or it is one thing, just a little bit of material or stuff to start to play with. That then, as you grow up and you become the person you want to be, you can decide to push against that, or to embrace it, or to do something with it. But the point is, it's starting material. So I don't need for Jews to be anything other than what they are, which is a good thing, because they never will be. And so I'm happy with that. I just want there to be more of a sense that people can create their own Jewish identity, and that it should be an imperative and something that's of value to them, because it was a value to the people around them.
Right.
I want there to be a reason for people to want to be Jewish, and I think that that's what our problem is. I don't think that we're really offering as a community compelling reasons to choose, because it is a choice now, to identify as a Jew and to be involved with this thing called the Jewish community. There is no, if I do have a mainstream culture that can satiate my, my Jewish soul with, some Jon Stewart, Yiddish quips or whatever, if that's what does it for you, great. But at the end of the day, I personally find there to be value and meaning in the stories of my tradition and the morals and the values and having the community and having the rituals, even if I'm not particularly theistic. I think it informs my life meaningfully. But I don't think that we actually are presenting people with that meaning in a way that appeals to them, in a way that can compete with contemporary popular culture or any other philosophical system that might be available to them. Instead, what I see is our community moving in a way that's more divisive and kind of gross and that is alienating and that people don't want to get near. And I think that the reason why you fund Jewish culture is because you give them other options on the smorgasbord of what Jewishness can be beyond the grody things that turn them off. And I think that if we don't invest in creating attractive alternatives, then you're going to lose future generations to greater levels of assimilation where they don't even regard themselves as Jews at all.
Great. And I had money on Philip Roth and Grody both being used in this evening's panel, so I'm happy about that.
I'd kind of want for both of those people to meet at the nexus of curiosity, which was formed out of what came before them that they don't know about and who they are. And that someplace in the conversation that I'd hope they would be in, and I tend to want the conversation to happen around texts because that's an area that I specialize in and have seen really work and people thrive in, that whatever's on their mind, whoever they are, wherever they've been, wherever they want to go, there's a place for them in the endless narrative of what's already come and the endless narrative of what could be. And you can get around the world and back in a text. And it doesn't matter if you have Hebrew. It doesn't matter what language it's in. You should do it with someone else. You should have a chavruta. You should have a study partner. And then you go. And I'd just say that, if we have time, we're just coming up on our Laba Festival with, 10 artists a year come in and do that. They come from a mix of people who have the background and who don't. And, maybe we'll let you peek into the gym where they're constructing this combination of Arabic and Hebrew based on a text we studied that's just never been seen before. And, the artist could share for himself how no one ever asked him to be curious about where he and it and that could meet. And now all these people are going to see it, and I hope they'll be curious, and that will make them grow. And the mystery of what it all means is just not for us to figure out, but it's beautiful and important.
And I want to go to the audience. Jenna Weissman-Jostler is here, and I wanted, who is the head of Judaic Studies at George Washington University. And so I wanted to hear her point, but I thought it was very important. We've talked about culture, and as someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about the provenance of words, this is, I think, the first time we've heard about growth, and the root of the word culture is in growth, and we think we're all talking about different types of growth and what we need to nurture that growth, where we need to see it go, and where we see it growing, and growth as distinct from pure consumption. Like, yes, you can eat a bagel and maybe you will grow, but I think that sort of trite growth is not petri dish, right? Exactly. So Jenna, I don't know whether you've if we could get Jenna a microphone just over there. So if there's either a question you have for our panelists or something that you would that has struck you about this evening.
Well, I am currently starting a brand new program, a master's program in Jewish cultural arts at GW, and each one of the issues that has been brought to the table and sent out into the world are the issues that I'm grappling with. The issue of cultural literacy, creating community, building community through the arts. And I just want to say that I am both heartened and baffled by the challenges that lie ahead. Clearly, there's something in the air. There's something in the zeitgeist that speaks to the importance of, dare I use that word, institutionalizing our need for culture and trying to figure out how to create a new generation of American Jews who are both inspired as well as fully grounded. So, Dan, I appreciate that.
Thank you. And Rebecca also has, who is, I forget your title, head of 6 Points Fellowships, director of 6 Points Fellowships, which is You explain what it is in concise words.
Sure. So the 6 Points Fellowship supports a group of emerging artists in New York and Los Angeles with significant funding to develop new Jewish projects, which primarily are presented in mainstream arts institutions. That's one of our fellows there, Galit Dardashti. And I'm extremely depressed about the state of funding for arts and culture, but I don't actually want to talk about that because I think too much about it in my regular life. And I also, probably in this room was the closest person to J-Dub. I was their first official volunteer. I sold T-shirts at the first Matis Yahoo concert. And there is something to be said about that, but I actually had a different question for the panel, which I've been trying to kind of put together from something people have said, which is, it started with this idea that Jewish arts and culture have been flourishing for the past 10 years. And I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on the panel about why that is. What is it about the current contemporary universe we live in as Jews, as people, New Yorkers, that has led to this time of flourishing? Because I certainly have seen it, but I also didn't really live through the 70s, so I'm not sure if that happened then too. So I wonder if you guys had any thoughts on that.
And just to flesh that out, if we had thoughts on why it flourished this century and what we can do to continue it flourishing, how we can continue that growth, as it were. I've got a lot of glazed faces at me, I think.
I don't know, for what it's worth, maybe Jody, you could help me with this, but from the music perspective, I think a lot of it did happen in music, and I think it did happen in the academy also. And it happened because of the identity politics of the 80s in particular. There was women's studies emergent, Afro-American studies emergent, Hispanic studies, whatever. You could sort of choose your identity structure. And there was a lot of that happening on the campus at the same time. So there was a huge increase in the number of chairs of Jewish studies. It became safe for funders to give money to universities for a Jewish cause. It became prestigious. That was not the case in the funding realm for the arts, but the cultural movement, I think, was similar. It had to do with a sense of freedom and exploration to explore a lot of the old stuff that people had some visceral contact with. And it's happening in the academy that those funding streams are drying up also. There's 5 people in the Intro to Kabbalah class at NYU this semester. That was not the case 5 years ago. There's a real...
Because there was more, there was 20.
There's just more people interested in it, I think, in part, but also we flooded. It got flooded, and now there's a lot of PhDs out there have Jewish studies degrees who have nowhere to work. So it's interesting.
I was going to just say that, once upon a time, I think we need a sociologist really, but if you think about where Jews would go to school and for what, the last several generations of kids would go to film school, they'd go to art school, they'd go to music school because their parents were doctors or lawyers or Indian chiefs, and they wanted their kids to have the pleasure of studying something that they cared about as opposed to something that they had to do to make a living. So I think that's also a piece of it.
I like to think it's because I could go to a bar and get drunk and listen to reggae music with my friends, and that was a Jewish experience. I didn't have to shuckle in a corner or get on a bus with a soldier, in order to have a Jewish experience. I could be myself and invite my non-Jewish friends who could celebrate my culture with me without it seeming like this weird cultish thing. I could be out about being a Jew, and I think that that's really the major thing that transformed at least my generation's participation in contributing to contemporary Jewish art and culture.
Was there a technological component to that? The proliferation of Jewish film festivals is partly to do with the ease of doing that. The internet obviously has led to.
I was going to say the internet just because that's the answer to any question about anything that's taken place in the last 15 years.
Right.
But just a word about what's going on in the academy, and this is anecdotal because this is just based on a few people I know, honestly. But the fact is, I think part of what the sense of ferment in the academy, maybe Ms. Joslett would be able to speak to this more better than, but there are people who are telling stories that haven't been told before. For a variety of reasons. Maybe because people are getting into archives, as simple as they're getting into archives that they hadn't gotten into before. But I think it's because they're asking questions they haven't before, and because as you say, there's a sense of freedom. There's this idea that we don't need to tell the normative, safe, triumphalist Jewish story. And for me, some of the things that have been most inspiring to encounter that have come out of the Academy are things that are a little messier. You know, that don't all end with "Yay, the Jews are the best," and it might even be, "Wow, the Jews are pretty interesting." I think of a friend of mine and a friend of, I'm sure, several people in this room, is this guy Eddie Portnoy, who's a Yiddishist who basically went through the Yiddish press for, he read the newspapers, and he found he wasn't just talking about, the old questions about what had gone on in Poland. He wasn't just talking about pogroms and the Holocaust, but he uncovered stories of Jewish wrestling champions and rabbinical sex scandals and things like that. Okay, fine, it's sort of juicy stuff, but it's also really interesting because it speaks to the varieties of Jewish experience and the different depths of Jewish experience that's out there. And so for me, I think part of what's gone on is just that people have been less afraid to address different types of
being less afraid, security and affluence. Look what we've done with it. And you could drag in the sociologist Richard Florida, the economist, what have you, and you talk about a creative reading of Rise of the Creative Class is to say, look how Jews have been innovators. Look how Jews have been drawn to the Academy, which Florida includes in the Creative Generator Hub, and look how that breeds new economic development and becomes a magnet for rejuvenation. So that's the definition of the golden age that we're enjoying as American Jews culturally.
Yeah, Alana?
I just want to say one very quick thing, which is that I also think you should ask yourself what you mean by the flourishing that happens in the last decade, because we also frequently think that the thing that we're experiencing is the newest, is actually new under the sun, and a lot is not. When I was the culture editor at The Forward before my current job, and I remember when in the first few months of my job, I went to everything that I got a press release for. And one of the things was in deepest Brooklyn in the middle of January in some 5-person theater, it was a play about Yiddish-speaking prostitutes. And so I sat through this horrible piece of theater, and then I was on my way out, and the playwright's sister, who's also her publicist, came over to me and said, "So, what do you think?" And I said, "It was nice." And she said, "Well, I mean, clearly it's the first play ever written about Yiddish-speaking prostitutes." And I was like, "Actually, no. That was in 1909 by Shalom Asch, and there were also lesbians." And there's something about that felt really instructive to me, that what we experience is new. And by the way, I don't think it's bad that we experience it is new. It's good, it makes us feel good, but it doesn't mean it is new. And so there is a flourishing that happened, but it happened in context of a Jewish culture that has had peaks and valleys for a long time.
Great. One last question from the audience. I think the gentleman at the back there let's just wait for the microphone so that we can all hear.
I don't have the mic really.
And the posterity can hear as well.
Yeah. I don't know if my question is that interesting. So first of all, thank you to all the panelists. I think we all really are grateful for that. I find a couple of things interesting, just that I've noticed that the various panelists have spoken about, and I'm just wondering how you would assess all these things. For instance, Dan, I find very interesting your idea that by drinking in a bar with your friends, listening to reggae, that was your Jewish experience. I'm thinking to myself, and that's not chuckling in a corner, and therefore it's not cultic. And I'm thinking to myself, well, no, maybe it is a little. So I think that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of Jewish arts and how we experience it, and Jewish culture and how we experience it, seems to be reactions. Really, we're all being very reactionary, in a sense, and Alana, you spoke about it as well. And I think that's really interesting. We don't want to talk about Israel, because Israel is a conflicted issue. We don't want to talk about the Holocaust, because Holocaust is a really conflicting issue. We feel like we've been oppressed by these issues. We've been hammered over the head with Holocaust guilt. We've been hammered over the head with a certain kind of right-wing Zionist ideology, and maybe that's become oppressive to us because it's not a nuanced enough discussion. We've been hammered over the head over religious issues, and I think feeling hammered over the head about these issues, I think, is right and good. I think that there really are a lot of, bring up a lot of difficult questions in how Jewish tradition is transmitted. Having said all that, what I want to know is, so how do we get back to some kind of middle ground where we can acknowledge Israel, the Holocaust, actual religious and textual content in our going forward with Jewish culture and Jewish arts, and how do we make a place for all that, and how do we do that? Because I think actually, I think about the people over the bridge, the really most dynamic part of the Jewish community is not represented in this room on the panel really at all, which is the Orthodox Jewish community, from which I'm a semi-refugee, but it's not represented very well at all. And I'm saying to myself, there's so much more out there, and how do we find a place for all of these things in new Jewish culture? I think that's actually a big question about the growth, and I want to have you to address all those issues.
And I think that comes to our larger question. I mean, and Ari talked about trying to address the difficult questions. Like, so, how do we address the difficult questions? How do we find a place for Klal Yisrael in both institutional Jewish culture and maybe Jewish culture written more large? And I mean, just to at the risk of sounding trite, well, now what? Peter's.
Yeah, well, I find the microphone in front of me, so I guess I have to answer the question. I actually think one of the solutions, I think the work is being made. I'm not sure that just buttoning onto the last set of questions about academia, I'm not sure that a flourishing of Jewish studies in academia presages the creation of art. I think it works the other way around, that the work needs to exist in order for people to come in as critics and thinkers and analysts and historians. I think the work is happening and can happen when we decouple a kind of rigid set of definitions about what Jewish arts and culture or Jewish experience needs to be from the creation of work. And this is what is really hard, and comes back a little bit to the question of institutional support and sort of the traditional ways that artists have to make their work, which is through patronage of some kind or another. As long as there is a certain set of somewhat rigid definitions about what artists can speak about in terms of expressing themselves Jewishly, politically, about ignoring the Holocaust or embracing it, as long as those prescriptions are there, we're going to be stuck. We're going to be paralyzed, frankly, either in running wholesale away from those subjects and the most interesting Jewish artists expressing themselves strictly in mainstream ways that aren't at all addressing a kind of literate Jewish experience, or we're going to be niche and narrow and irrelevant.
I was going to just say, you said it better, but it's about not being utilitarian. Not expecting that the art is going to do X or Y, and it's going to solve this problem or that problem, but because if you really let it flourish and let artists speak about what they find important, and you give them some good tools and some good toolkits for investigation, then you'll get some powerful work, and that decoupling is kind of critical to the flourishing.
And yeah, Jody, let's. I mean, I think we're moving towards final comments, so let's go through.
One very partial answer to your question, I think, is that I think actually there is a lot of interesting stuff going on in synagogues in this country with young rabbis who are reimagining how Jewish communal life can work, but they're not, throwing life cycle and holidays out on the scrap heap by any means. I mean, I do think that, as we said, the texts, the holidays, you can't have a vibrant Jewish artistic life or Jewish culture without a vibrant religious culture. You can't, and because I think that the meaningful engagement with Jewish life and the arts does come from a kind of literacy, and literacy starts there. And I know that, I personally know a couple of young rabbis who've really, who are leading, communities of young Jews, young families, in really interesting ways. And so I think that that's one way to get at this problem.
Cool. Jody brought up a really interesting point, or something I think that is important to moving forward and to nurturing creativity is that, in my opinion, I think we still have a lot to fight against within the Jewish community in terms of preconceptions about Jewishness and Jewish culture and who we are. And to be honest with you, I mean, to be blunt, I think there's still a lot of internalized anti-Semitism, internalized self-hatred that Jews have to deal with because of the violence of the assimilation process that's taken place since 1881, let's say. And that Jews have a lot of negative feelings towards their own culture or ambivalence. So, for example, Eddie Portnoy is amazing, right? Like, and he uncovers the coolest stuff. But it was interesting that you said it wasn't just, Der Alter Heim, Poland, it was prostitutes and wrestlers. But that was your preconception. In fact, there is so much more to Yiddish than, people talking about their bubbies and zadies. But I don't know why, or maybe I do know why, but this is something that we have to fight against because Eddie Portnoy is hardly the only person who's talking about this stuff. I mean, I have had really fun, long conversations with my friend Michael Steinloff about the special dedicated mikvahs for prostitutes in Poland, okay? This is, a specialized topic. It's very interesting. And it's not the kind of thing you expect to hear about when you're talking about Yiddish if you're expecting to hear Bubby Zadie. So I think that we have a tremendous amount of work to do in thinking about how we came to be, how we came to see ourselves and our own culture and our own history, and really undoing a lot of that internalized self-hatred.
Right. Other people have some final comments, Stephen?
Well, I think one thing that we haven't talked about is that Jewish culture, Petri dish, we talked about the Petri dish. It's about an ecosystem. A healthy ecosystem doesn't exist based on one thing. It only exists based on many things. And sometimes a healthy ecosystem can actually get the toxicity out if something's not working. And I think one thing that happened 10 years ago, there was a lot of money available from foundations for new ideas, for innovative ideas. I'm not exactly sure why. It could have been the stock market. I don't know. I could think more deeply about it. But what happened, and Elise certainly knows this, we all know this, there was money out there to start new things. There is now a constantly chasing after these tiny pieces of cheese. It costs more to fill out the forms and chase a $25,000 grant than it's worth to chase it. Especially when the topic that's important to the funder will change next year, or they will go into a strategic planning mode, which requires the end of the funding cycle immediately. So, what's happened is rather than being committed to the long-term health of the ecosystem of the Jewish people, which should by definition be permeable, because ecosystems have to breathe, they need sun, they need light. It's just basic logic and science. If you don't breathe, you die. If you don't get light, you die. If you don't eat and drink, you die. Ecosystems are simple to understand. Obviously, we don't take care of the earth, so how could we take care of the Jewish people? But let's assume that we have the capability to think logically for a moment. It's about thinking in terms of funding cycles and fiscal years and metrics. I can come up with metrics as good as any of them. And I know that, the Foundation for Jewish Culture and the 6 Point Fellowships and any other number of entities, including JDub, all right? But it really doesn't matter if there is such a level of hubris in the funding system that doesn't see the ecosystem as a whole, and then we who are engaged in a particular part of the addiction to the funding, it goes away, and then you just are dead. So, holistic, ecosystem-oriented, holistic approach to Jewish life with arts as a central element, earth, fire, water, culture, etc. That's how we live.
I think one other one other thing we just need to take into account, coming back to the question of Jewish culture versus popular culture, is, as Americans, we also have limited attention spans and limited dollars, and where do we choose to spend our time and our money? And can Jewish culture really compete ultimately? Is the product actually good enough, interesting enough, compelling enough, inspiring enough to spend our time and money on? And the truth is, as a person who's been writing about alternative Jewish culture for the last decade, I don't really think that much that's coming out is actually all that good, whether it's funded or not. And I think that the ultimate reality is that the Jewish stuff that manages to break through into the mainstream culture is the good stuff. And they don't come to the Jewish community because the Jewish community isn't interested in the good stuff. I think because we're a provincial community, or at least the funders, I think, are provincial in their outlook, they're interested in what appeals to them, not what appeals to a broad Jewish audience, not what appeals to assimilated mainstream Jews. They're interested in what speaks to themselves as usually people who are maybe more religious or more conservative politically, and it doesn't speak to the masses. So I think that we're going to be entering a kind of darker period in Jewish culture because I don't see, really invigorating new Jewish culture coming up, and I don't see funding there to support it if it were to arise.
Great. And Ari?
I don't think we ever got to talk about Israel tonight, but I will say that in this age of zapping attachments across the ocean, quickly translated, we are now in a new period where we can program Israeli work for American audiences interpreted by American Jewish and non-Jewish artists that is enriching us in profound ways. I could program an entire season of Israeli work that would sell and that would that would teach us and would connect us in profound ways. We have an artists' corps in Washington, D.C. that has made such significant relationships with the artists of Israel. This is a kind of community-to-community, people-to-people engagement that is really exciting. We can't be afraid of this pipeline. We have to engage it. We have to allow for all of its many messages to mix up with our audience. And so I think that's a new, exciting chapter, and increasingly organizations throughout the country are giving voice to Israeli artists in English or through PowerPoint and translated work of Israeli artists coming here. And I think that's just another thing that's augmenting, enhancing Jewish culture in America.
Yeah. David?
I've heard so many enthusiasms from this panel, and I suspect the audience has its own set of enthusiasms for what they think is great Jewish art that's being made right now. And that's, I think, where our immediate future is in the sheer variety of what's being produced, as opposed to trying to identify what is the next big thing. Because the next big thing is a boring idea. I think that variety is at the base of the health of this ecosystem that you're alluding to. I know from my organization, we're a funder, a small funder, but give micro grants to artists. And some of the most interesting work that we've been funding has been Jewish artists positioning themselves with artists coming from other cultures where there are bridges, alliances, creative sharings that go on that produce absolutely astonishing work. Jewish audiences want to go to this work. Non-Jewish audiences want to go to this work. We all want to belong to this larger world that most of us believe that we belong to. Very few of us only belong to the Jewish community.
Okay, thank you. And I think the only person who's not spoken since that is Alana, if you wanted the word or not. I mean,
I think that the only last thing that I would say is that in a strange way, I actually come at this from the perch of an observer, and an observer of a media institution that's technically devoted to Jewish life and culture, but that also is on the internet. And you can, whoever you are, you can actually go to that website. It doesn't require you to be Jewish. And we cover both the Jewish culture that is sort of the mainstream Jewish culture, and we also cover the particular Jewish culture that is funded and comes out of the Jewish community. And I'm nothing but an optimist. I am a cautious optimist. I'm an optimist that believes in encouraging the good people and the good institutions in the community to continue to do their work. But I do believe that there's just enormous vibrancy to the time that we're in right now. And without being a Pollyanna, I do want to say that the people who are doing some really great work deserve to be recognized as part of a really great moment.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank the Posen Foundation, the 14th Street Wide. We're very proud and forward to sponsor this event. And I'd like to thank Peter, Dan, Ari, Stephen, David, Ruchel, Alana, Jody, and Elise for coming out and helping us here.